It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Fleet, Professor Emeritus in Political Science. Is that right? Political Science is the name of the program department. At Marquette University, class of 1963, St. Mary Scholars. Completed the majority of the integral curriculum, though somehow he got out of the junior and senior laboratories.
Does he have a formula for that?
I think this lecture is a way of paying that debt. But whether we accept it as such remains to be seen. All right. So after graduating, Mr. Fleet moved on to study at UCLA, his doctorate in 1970, and then taught at a number of places. This unknown school named Gonzaga. I think there was a little UC Santa Cruz mixed in there. USC for 5 years, but ended up at Marquette for the remainder of his long and successful academic career. I will not try to go through the list of his publications. There are many and various and impressive. A student of political philosophy, but had interests and language skills and travel experience that led him towards Latin American politics. And so we will see this kind of integration, if you will, of interest and training in the lecture that it is our pleasure to hear now. So please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Fleet.
Thank you very much for your invitation and for your welcome. I'd like to say before beginning how pleased and honored I am to be here. I'd like to start my remarks with 4 questions that I suggest you think about and that we later talk about. They're not meant to guide or to constrain your reception, your digestion of what I say, but keep them in mind. I think you might find them useful. The first question is, if even Catholics and Christians have a hard time coming together politically, how possibly can Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, and Hindus do this? The second question is whether or not globalization can be given a human face. A third question asks if the downside of neoliberal economic policies can be mitigated by worker participation or by retraining programs or by compensatory benefit programs. And the last question is, how viable today is the political center, both in winning elections and in then governing once in power? In 1985, while Chile was still under military rule, I wrote a book I called The Rise and Fall of Chilean Christian Democracy. In it, I argued that the party commonly known and referred to as the PDC, I argued that party was finished politically, given the divergent interests of its many supporters, the conflicting objectives of its internal factions, and the polarization of Chilean politics at this time. I was wrong. Over the next several years, the country's socialist and communist parties joined the Christian Democrats in a center-left coalition, the Concertation for Democracy, that has dominated the country's politics since. During the 1990s, the PDC was again the country's leading political party. as it had been before the 1973 coup that overthrew Salvador Allende. In 1996, however, the party's fortunes did begin to decline, and by 2009, its electoral base had been cut in half. This time, the internal divisions were as much a consequence as the cause of its decline. Other factors were clearly more important, among them the restrictive power structures and relationships that were left in place by the dictator Pinochet, changes that had taken place in the country's demographic and cultural composition, and increased competition and congestion in the center of the country's political spectrum. What I only realized in time, however, was that the PDC's difficulties were both a Chilean phenomenon and part of the decline of Christian democratic parties everywhere and of political parties generally. In fact, European scholars had been talking for a number of years about a Christian democratic crisis since the mid-1990s, a consequence, they say, of the end of the Cold War in the late 80s and the secularization of European societies that had been ongoing since at least the 1960s. In Chile, initially, people asked where the PDC itself might have gone wrong. But when concertation governments that followed those led initially by the Christian Democrats failed to fare any better than they did, observers saw more clearly the challenges that any government faces in today's globalized economy and highly mediated politics. Parties everywhere, it seems, are having to accommodate investors in financial institutions at the expense of programs that help the poor and the undereducated. All parties face congested political arenas in which the media, social networks, protest movements, and economic elites can reach and influence citizens independently without going through political parties. All parties are having trouble attracting younger voters and retaining the loyalties of once established or once loyal supporters, as media personalities, populist movements, and single-issue parties barge into political arenas, promising to give disgruntled voters what they want but are not getting from their governments and from their seemingly unsympathetic parties. In other words, Chile is not the only country whose mainstream parties were being challenged, nor were the Christian Democrats of Chile the only party whose membership rolls, whose approval ratings, and whose electoral support have fallen off of late. In sum, its decline is part of the broader crises of Christian democracy and of political parties generally in a world increasingly skeptical of institutions and ideologies, in which people no longer believe that their party or their leaders represent them or their interests. To place Christian democracy and Christian democratic parties in proper perspective, I'd like to say a few things about their origins and their foundational values and principles. Then I'll address the problem of their internal divisions and then return to the reasons I believe help to explain their decline. When they first emerged as a significant political force following the Second World War, Christian democratic parties were something of a novelty, holding conservative views on issues relating to life, human sexuality, and the family, but opposed to the socioeconomic status quo and committed to liberal and democratic values. In both Latin America and Europe, they offered an attractive alternative to the right, tainted as it was by its wartime collaboration or by its connection or link to a discredited older order. But also from the left, whose parties seemed to threaten both democracy and stability. Christian democratic parties were not confessional parties in any formal sense of the term. Most party members were Catholics, but this was not a condition of their membership. Nor were these parties subject to church authorities. They claimed inspiration in Christian values, but insisted on their right to interpret and apply those values in public life, a position that popes and bishops came to accept as proper and legitimate over time. For the first 40 years of existence, these parties flourished politically. Prior to 1990, the average vote share of the 17 Latin American parties was 17.3% of the total number of votes. Of the 19 Western European countries, an even higher, 25.6% of the total vote. Their supporters and adherents included businessmen, young professionals, merchants, civil servants, white-collar employees, small farmers, peasants, and in some countries, industrial workers. Most parties settled and came to dominate the center and center-right sections of the political spectra of their countries. In those countries where workers were an important constituency, the party's positions on economic issues were closer to those of social democratic and socialist parties of the left. Since 1990, the electoral fortunes of Christian democratic parties in both Europe and Latin America have declined notably. 3 of the 17 Latin American parties have disappeared, and the average vote share of the others has fallen to 12% and to 7.5% if you look at only the most recent election. In Mexico, where the PAN, the Partido de Acción Nacional, was the country's only right-wing party, the basis of its appeal is probably in its conservative character rather than its Christian democratic credentials. Christian Democrats have done better in Western Europe, where only the French and Italian parties have been absorbed by other forces, and where the average vote share of the remaining parties has dropped by less than 4 percentage points, although it would fall to 14% from 23.9 if only the most recent electoral results were considered. But here too, of the 4 parties, those in Germany, Luxembourg, and Spain, that have managed to buck this downward trend, only one of them, the Austrian party, faces a significant challenge on its right. In post-Soviet Central Europe, following the coming down of the wall and the abdication by Communist Party authorities, Christian democratic parties failed to take root in 8 of the 15 countries and have been absorbed by or are entirely dependent upon larger conservative parties in Lithuania, Croatia, and Hungary, and are currently only minor players in Slovenia, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. Christian democratic parties are having trouble attracting younger voters of late. Their longer standing supporters are aging and dying off. Others have been drawn away to center parties, to ethno-national parties, to anti-system populist parties, and in some cases to social democratic parties. Additionally, the internal factions with which most are still afflicted have persisted and intensified in recent years, blurring and perhaps tainting the party's political image. In particular, young workers and younger members of the parties have challenged the austerity programs and neoliberal policies embraced by their leaders since 1990 as inconsistent with the importance attached to community and solidarity with the poor. Whether this is the case or not, that the policies of existing Christian democratic countries, parties are in keeping with or inconsistent with Christian democratic values and principles depends on how those are defined. I agree with those in the field who stress the ideological distinctiveness of Christian democratic parties, one that is rooted in principles to which party leaders often refer in their justification of the party's positions on particular issues. I don't think they're just another middle-of-the-road party characterized, as some of their critics would have it, as pragmatic and opportunistic. The principles to which they are committed do link them together and set them apart from other parties and party families. But as I hope to show momentarily, these principles that unite them are not always understood or applied in practice in compatible or similar ways. A word or two about their foundational values and principles. Christian democracy was inspired and nurtured by the social encyclicals of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, by Catholic lay people active in church-sponsored organizations, and by the writings of Maritain, Mounier, and other Catholic social philosophers, beginning in the 1930s. The movement's embrace of democracy and its search for an alternative to existing economic institutions and practices rested on principles rooted in these sources. They distinguish Christian democracy from conservative Catholic parties of the 19th century, of which it is often seen as, and wrongly in my judgment, seen as an extension. They're also different from more recent convert parties, that is, parties who have converted to Christian democracy in both Western and Central Europe. They claim to be, but in my judgment, are not really Christian democratic parties. The Greek party, New Democracy, the Irish party, Fine Gael, claim to be Christian democratic, but in my judgment are not. Catholic social teaching emerges in the late 19th century as the church takes up the social question and takes up the plight of workers, particularly Catholic workers, caught between profit-hungry employers and socialist agitators. This was the thrust, for example, of the encyclical Rerum Novarum, in which Pope Leo XIII defends the rights of workers to organize and petition for better living and working conditions. His views were further developed in the encyclicals and apostolic letters of his successors, such as John XXIII's Mater et Magistra, and the resolutions of numerous councils and synods of bishops. At the heart of this Catholic social teaching is the affirmation of the dignity of each human person. This is the foundation on which the idea of the common good, the universal destination of all material goods, and the principles of solidarity, participation, and subsidiarity all rest. The responsibility for attaining the common good falls on both the individual person and the state, since, I quote, "Since the common good is the reason that political authority exists," unquote, and is able, to quote again, "to guarantee the coherency, unity, and organization of civil society of which it is an expression. The state is bound to promote citizen participation and to respect the principle of solidarity, according to which, quote, it is a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater or higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. There's a tension here that's posited between rightful state authority and the rights of individual persons, and the rights of natural communities, such as the family, neighborhood associations, and territorial entities in which they are formed. The principles on which Catholic social teaching rests are permanent and inalterable, but it is a work in progress, keeping pace with new discoveries and changing circumstances, and subject to reflection and refinement over time. In the years following Rerum Novarum, priests assigned by their bishops organized Catholic students and young Catholic workers in both Europe and Latin America. Catholic organizations sprung up everywhere, led by priest activists like Father Cardine, Father Sturzo, and a number of outstanding priest activists in Latin America, charged with spreading the faith and defending church interests. These young workers, young Catholic workers and young Catholic students were to steer clear of politics and other unhealthy distractions. This proved difficult. Many of the students and workers to whom Catholic Action activists reached out were already engaged politically. Their contacts with these students and workers proved contagious, and young Catholic activists were quickly drawn into politics, distancing themselves from their church authorities and from other traditional Catholic or Catholic-based parties. These developments were welcomed by progressive bishops, priests, and lay people, but viewed with some alarm by more conservative elements and by Pope Leo as well. He was worried that lay Catholics, and especially workers and people, especially workers and the poor, would lose their way if not closely monitored. In a subsequent encyclical, Leo, an encyclical entitled Gravis Commune, he warned of the dangers of politics, of popular government, and of lay people acting independently of church authorities. He was also critical of the Christian democratic movements of his time, suggesting that they cared only for the poor, and that they neglected other social classes, and that their unjust disparagement of non-democratic forms of power could lead to attacks on all non-democratic forms of authority. Neither Pope Leo nor his successors, Popes Pius X and XI, had confidence in the judgment of lay people, nor did they believe that it was as important for people to choose freely to do the right thing as it was to do it. In fact, it would not be until the 1940s that a Catholic Pope would embrace democratic principles and encourage their practice. For these social activists and for early Christian Democrats, the commitment to democratic values was nourished not by their reading of the social encyclicals, but by the writings of Catholic social philosophers, beginning in the 1930s. One such philosopher was the neo-Thomist Jacques Maritain. His integral humanism provided young Catholics with a critique of laissez-faire capitalism and revolutionary socialism, and it proposed instead a Christian, democratic, and communitarian alternative. At its heart was a principled defense of political democracy at a time when the church itself was unwilling to take such a step. Maritain did so for two reasons: his commitment to individual freedom and his insistence on striking a balance between individual human rights to self-government and private property and the common good of all. to which all members of society were called to work. Political leaders, in Maritain's view, were to be chosen by and accountable to the people, not as agents or spokespersons for this or that block of citizens, but as representatives of their hidden will and as stewards of the common good. Emmanuel Mounier was another French thinker to whom future Christian Democrats were intellectually drawn. Like Maritain, he stressed the transcendence of the individual human person and their solidarity with one another, a solidarity reflecting the desire for community, not just survival and not just material advantage, but community. Personalism was an alternative to what Mounier saw as the shallow individualism of bourgeois democracy and the materialism of secular socialism. And he too was a staunch defender of democracy based on the Christian ideal of being in communion with others, and not on the bourgeois ideal of having for oneself. Two additional pillars of early Christian democracy were the French sociologists Louis-Joseph Libret and the American Jesuit John Courtney Murray. Libret's work on the structural obstacles to social and economic development were widely read in the 40s and 50s and had a major influence on Catholic social teaching in the modern era. Murray, not read widely outside the United States, also addressed issues of religious freedom and church-state separation, and underscored what he saw as a natural affinity between democracy and Christianity. Both Libret and Murray were very influential in the period leading up to the Second Vatican Council and helped to shape many of its resolutions. Christian Democrats thus believe in the inviolable dignity of each human person, the right of each to religious and political freedom, to meaningfully and justly rewarded work, and to the basic necessities of life. They are therefore devoted to the common good of a society as a whole, which people and political authorities are duty-bound to promote. The economy of such a society should produce sufficiently and distribute equitably. Its political order should be open to the participation of all and accountable to all. In sum, a properly structured society for Christian Democrats should be economically equitable, socially integrated, and politically democratic. But while a consensus on these matters might separate one political party from another in theory, this may not amount to as much in practice. Political ideologies involve issues and challenges going beyond these general notions. Matters of interpretation, priority among values, and assessments of the risks and the costs in defending or extending human rights must all be faced. A case in point is the preferential option for the poor, a concept that arose as a core element of Catholic social teaching in the 1960s. According to the compendium of the social teaching of the Church published by the Vatican, it's defined in the following way: the principle of the universal destination of goods requires that the poor, the marginalized, and in all cases those whose living conditions interfere with their proper growth, should be the focus of particular concern. To this end, the preferential option for the poor should be reaffirmed in all of its force. This concept was first advanced by the Peruvian liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez in the 1960s and was later embraced by Pope Paul VI in the 1968 at the Conference of Latin America in Medellin. Pope John Paul II was less enamored of the concept, expressing reservations in his address to the same Latin American bishops years later at Puebla in Mexico, although the concept was affirmed in the final resolutions of that conference. Today, no one quarrels with the concept, and yet honoring it in practice is a complicated matter. What, for example, is the relationship between economic growth and the reduction of poverty and inequality? And which is more important, the end of poverty or the reduction of inequality? And what's more important than either objective, and the means with which the objectives are pursued? And with what urgency need one pursue them? In recent years, most Latin American and European Christian Democrats have been willing to live with inequality and to limit anti-poverty initiatives so as not to adversely affect economic growth or stability. There are, however, in almost every party, dissenting elements who've been critical of this practice on the part of their leaders. In these matters, in other words, diverse notions and priorities regarding poverty, inequality, and growth, and different assessments of the consequences of alternative courses of action, allow people who aspire to the same things to be at odds on what to do. A pledge of allegiance to normative prescriptions alone, then, is not sufficient. One must also determine what practically can be done to promote them effectively. And this is a function of how one sees cause and effect relationships involving social forces. These, however, are questions on which Catholic social thinking is silent. This is not a flaw of the Church's teaching, but a limitation that leaves matters like these to lay people as they weigh in the light of their best understanding of the likely consequences of alternative courses of action. Because they think differently on social forces, on questions involving social forces and relationships, I think it's a good idea to look more closely at how Christian democratic values and principles inform the decision of party leaders and the actions of the party. These are the principal functions, I'm going to suggest, of one's ideology. Ideology is something I define as a set of judgments and assertions that portray how societies actually work and how they should be fashioned and structured in the light of one's ideals, but in the face of these characteristic features of social reality. There are other features or other characteristics, of course, that you and I both might associate with the term ideology, like wishful thinking and like self-interested thinking and like manipulative thinking. Ideology conjures up those associations, I think. But I use the term in a non-pejorative sense, as a framework with which people try to make sense of their world and of what is to be done in it and about it. In a nutshell, an ideology, in my understanding of the term, is an effort to blend what is seen as good or desirable with what is believed to be possible or feasible. An ideology consists of judgments, of value and fact, at various levels. At the first and foremost of these levels, the judgments are philosophical and religious in nature. They define such things as the meaning of life, the nature of love, happiness, freedom, equality, justice, community, of what it takes and what it means for men and women to flourish. In short, At this level, ideological thinkers take positions on what is good and desirable generally, or in the abstract. But philosophical and religious values don't determine one's social or political practice. That requires a second, mediating level of judgment. A theory of history, a theory of social reality, that I call one's sociological perspective, or in Charles Taylor's term, social imaginary. It is formed by both normative values and empirical or historical observation. It identifies forces and factors that drive social relationships and that enable one to produce adequately and to distribute equitably, for example. In other words, a sociological perspective, the sort I'm saying the church is not able or willing to offer, helps one to reconcile notions of what is good, laudable, or desirable with what is seen to be feasible, and under what conditions. For the last 3 centuries or so, the views of Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and of Max Weber have been among the most influential sources for thinking about such matters. I would add Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Louis Rousseau, I can't remember. Thank you. And of course Hegel, to mention Marx. In the very next breath you must add Hegel. Each of these thinkers has emphasized certain phenomena and certain relationships over and above others. Each of them has spawned multiple amendments, refinements, and extensions by disciples and epigones. Each of them has found receptive ears among Christian Democrats. Perspectives like these sociological perspectives, to try to integrate aspirational ideals with what one sees to be human possibility, also inform judgments, ideological judgments at other levels. One of those other levels is the definition of concrete historical objectives, believed to be feasible at a certain point in time, to which then a party or its leaders may commit themselves. These concrete historical objectives form the basis for policies and initiatives that deal with things like democratization, humanitarian intervention, the entering into free or fair trade agreements, reforms of any number of different sorts. Arguably, they represent the best that one can hope for under current or foreseeable circumstances. In recent years, issues on which internal debate and division within Christian democratic parties have arisen run the gamut of related subject matter. Free markets, globalization, inflationary pressure, budget deficits, unemployment, you name it. Questions relating to the family, to gender equality, to contraception, to sexual activity, abortion, and the environment. These are fundamental challenges of our time on which people who share common values and ideals disagree as matters of concrete historical challenge. Divergent perspectives on these questions have made it very difficult for Christian democratic parties to present a united front in support of their agendas. 2 additional levels, and then I'm done with this complicated business of ideology for a while, involve the selection of strategies and tactics in the pursuit of one's historical objectives. A strategy is a plan that makes the best possible use of one's resources while blunting those of one's opponents and dealing with other obstacles that might work to one's advantage. Tactics, on the other hand, are the means used to mobilize and deploy one's resources more efficiently. Like concrete objectives, strategy and tactics are also informed by one's sociological perspective. Again, something on which the church herself is silent. Given these multiple layers or phases of ideological judgment, the commitment of Christian Democrats to their traditional, their foundational values and principles loses some of its political heft. Without consensus in the way people see the world in the movement of history, they're not likely to apply these principles in the same manner in practice. At these moments, differing sociological perspectives lead those aspiring to similar goals to draw diverse ideological and political conclusions. In effect, the various levels of ideological judgment are forks along the road at which travelers inspired by the same values can part company. In sum, shared principles alone don't assure a distinctive identity or a uniform behavior. Not all Christian Democrats define or rank order their principles in the same way. They frequently differ over what can and should be done at particular points. Most parties, in fact, contain identifiable factions. Usually, a smaller socially progressive pro-labor group, a larger, generally moderate faction that's more liberal on social issues, but may or may not be pro-business on economic issues. And finally, a smaller, socially conservative and resolutely pro-business wing. When the votes are cast, and most parties, when votes are cast, most parties fall into line with what the party leadership has decided. Others do so as well, but grumble a lot in the process. And finally, some, depending on the issue, refuse to go along at all. And in fact, may actually bolt the party and start another party that's truly a Christian Democratic Party in their judgment. Given the reality of these internal factions, it's remarkable that Christian Democratic parties have endured and have prospered politically for as long as they have. In general, those on the center-right and not having to face until recently challenges on the right have done better electorally, albeit at the expense, at least to some extent, of their Christian democratic ideals and principles. But to speculate about their survival as Christian democratic parties moving forward requires an explanation of the reasons for their decline to this point. And so I'd like to shift gears a little and move away from rather philosophical and abstract reflections to a little more social science. This could be even harder for some of you to digest as the social sciences start to tease answers to complicated questions out of data that is not manipulable, that is not reproducible under well-defined conditions. It's a game of guessing and of thinking imaginatively about things that don't lend themselves. So what we might ask, do we know about the causes of this decline among Christian democratic parties that I described at the outset? Factionalism of the sort that I've been emphasizing has surely been a persistent and politically costly problem for many. But a party's internal divisions can be both the cause and a consequence of its other difficulties. And the fact is that a party's electoral rise and fall, that a party's electoral fortunes rise and fall for any number of other reasons. The possibilities are almost endless. A stagnant economy, a rising level of unemployment, crime rates, failing public schools, corruption in high places, lackluster leadership, the gamut. And so beyond these short-term, I would call them circumstantial factors, there are also what historians and social scientists call structural forces at play or at work here, over which the parties themselves, unlike circumstantial forces, parties themselves have no control at all. But these structural forces nonetheless limit the party's electoral and political prospects. Three such factors commonly alluded to by scholars in the literature on Christian democracy are demographic changes, the end of the Cold War, and the increasingly secular turn that Latin American and European countries have taken since the 1960s. I will look at each of these and add two structural forces or factors of my own, the first of which is the ascendancy since the 1980s of the neoliberal economic model and its related policies, and secondly, the vastly diminished role of party legislators in the policy-making process from about the mid-80s on. That is, prime ministers and presidents now dominate policy-making, particularly in the economic area, but in virtually all other areas, at the expense of legislatures that once played a very active role in the bargaining that took place around such things. These have influenced the decline of Christian democratic parties as well. Let me briefly outline each one of these five and we'll be done. Demographic factors. Among the relevant demographic changes in the late 20th century in Latin America and in Europe have been the drop in the percentage of a country's total population living in rural areas, a shrinking of the rural population of countries. The rural population had been a real important basis electorally for Christian democratic parties. Also the rise, the increase, the expansion of the middle classes, also a traditionally historic important constituency for Christian democratic parties. But when you look at the actual experience of individual countries, declining rural populations don't appear to be a factor at all. Christian democratic parties do wonderfully where there are virtually nobody to speak of living in rural areas as they're defined. And you have the reverse phenomena as well. There's just no direct, constant relationship between Christian democratic political fortunes and the size of a country's rural population relative to others. With respect to the middle classes, however, it has expanded everywhere, and you'd think that would be good for the Christian Democrats, and yet this is a different middle class than the one on which they had relied before 1990. This is a middle class of younger people, far more entrepreneurial in orientation, far less concerned about questions of justice, and far more about opportunities for initiative. A generation of citizens less open to the teachings of the Catholic Church on these matters. And so it's happened that Christian democratic rhetoric, even if it's not always lived up to, falls flat on the ears of the new middle classes. I'll not say any more. You may want to ask questions about that in our time for conversation at the end. The second of these structural realities is the end of the Cold War. It was said early on in the 90s that the Cold War had given rise to a political context tailor-made for Christian democratic parties. Their reform agenda was a an attractive alternative to the heartless conservatism and godless the revolution of their opponents, the right and the left of the time. And that when that Cold War subsided, and their right-wing rivals were once again respectable, and their left-wing rivals less fearsome, Christian democratic parties began to decline. Well, here I would argue that the Cold War was not very much help at all to the countries of the Christian democratic parties of Latin America, and that it only helped some countries in Europe, Austria, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, but not many others. Not Greece, not Portugal, not Spain, nor Ireland, nor any of the Scandinavian countries, where the issue was not one of a discredited right and a plausibly threatening left. Spain, Greece, and Portugal were under military governments and dictatorships. The right had not gone into hiding, just to give you one example. With respect to Central Europe, it was true of Western Europe, it's probably true for it as well. The Cold War was certainly helpful, maybe even a necessary condition for Christian democratic success, but it was hardly a sufficient one. The third and the most frequently cited structural explanation for the decline of Christian democratic parties is the secularization of the societies in which they operate or compete. Secular societies are characterized by low levels of religiosity and by high levels of differentiation. This concept of differentiation is the process by which spheres of activity like the state, the economy, and science come to be governed by their own laws and regulations, and therefore freed from the tutelage of religious or moral authorities. The society becomes differentiated, and individual areas within society generate, produce, and abide by their own rules, independently of an overarching institution or authority that would pass judgment on all activity. Differentiation. The expectation among people who accept the secularization thesis is that electoral support for religiously inspired parties like the Christian Democrats will be higher in more religious and less differentiated societies, and lower in more highly differentiated but less religious societies. But in Latin America, these predictions are only borne out in 3 of the 12 country cases, in Chile, Uruguay, and Mexico, but in none of the others. That is, the wrong relationship between levels of religiosity and differentiation on the one hand and political success on the other emerged. In Europe, the relationship was closer to that predicted by the theory. That is, it was borne out in 8 of the 12 countries. Germany, Luxembourg, Spain, and Italy in Europe were the outliers, or were the countries that did not fulfill the predicted profile. Germany, Luxembourg, and Spain all had very high levels of differentiation and low levels of religiosity, and yet Christian democratic parties did just fine in those countries. Italy was the reverse, or at least almost perfectly the reverse. A very high level for an advanced industrial society, a very high level of religiosity, and yet not enough to save the Christian Democratic Party from its own self-destruction. The fourth of these structural variables or explanations is the neoliberal model. The hegemonic status enjoyed by neoliberal policies in the post-war world. In the paper from which this lecture is drawn, I describe neoliberalism and its assumptions in quite a bit of detail. I won't impose that upon you. I'll only say with the collapse of state socialism and cutbacks imposed since then as well on welfare states in both Latin America and Europe, neoliberalism has become the only economic model acceptable to international financial institutions and to the treasury ministries of most national governments. This hegemony of neoliberal economics has supposedly forced governments to adopt policies that generate growth but do not distribute its benefits equitably, which in turn presumably alienates the poor and the working class and therefore costs Christian democratic parties and other parties associated with neoliberal strategies its electoral support. To see if any relationship exists at all between economic policies and political outcomes, I look at the actual policies pursued by Christian democratic governments or the ruling coalition of which Christian democratic parties are a part during their time in office. And I relate it to how well these policies worked for that period of time and what effect, if any, observable they had on Christian democratic parties' political fortunes. I conclude that while no Christian democratic party embraced neoliberal policies fully, some did a lot more than others. Secondly, that the economic effects associated with these policies vary enormously, although in most instances they were more effective in promoting growth, although not always they were able to do that, but more effective at doing that than in reducing poverty or distributing its benefits equitably. And thirdly, that their impact on political fortunes for the parties associated with them was more often than not overridden by the impact of other variables, voter fears for other reasons having nothing to do with the economy. One more structural variable and we're done. This one has to do with the role of political parties and legislative representatives affiliated with political parties in the policy-making process. It seems that this has been very hard on both the legislators themselves and their constituents to whom they make promises in order to get elected, and for whom they cannot deliver on these promises because of their inability to influence in the content of the policy and in the effects of the policies being carried out on their constituents. So they're very, very unhappy. Their constituents are very unhappy. And while some legislators hang on, do what they can, and try to hold on to their seats as best they can, others are badly frustrated, and their frustrations lead them into less savory compensatory activities. Can't influence policy, why not grab a little off the top while I can? It's not a coincidence. There has been an extraordinarily high increase in the amount of corrupt practices and incidents involving legislators or involving bureaucratic officials affiliated with political parties since 1990, since the loss of their voice and their participation in the formulation of these policies. They're unhappy and they take it out in forms such as illicit fundraising, influence peddling, pork barreling, infighting within their respective parties for positions of power within the party, and endless party politicking. Most of these activities are tied to ensuring their reelection or preparing for the day in which they will leave office. In the process, they do enormous damage to their party's image and to the image of the political system as a whole. As a result, the morale of the party, the cohesion of the party, the public approval ratings of the party, and here we include the Christian Democratic parties, decline markedly. And new parties and political movements, led by wealthy businessmen, media personalities, populist demagogues, have entered the political arenas in the old world and the new, challenging mainstream political parties like the Christian Democrats. And in some cases, replacing them. The idea is, in other words, that political parties have lost their credibility in the face of these developments and are now under attack and challenge by non-professional politicians whose credibility and whose appeal come from their lack of involvement with such a corrupt process and their apparent success, the translatability or the transferability of their success in one field to that of politics. Conclusions. The experiences of Christian Democratic parties present an observer with varying outcomes and potentially relevant variables. Decline is the general rule, except for those who have not been challenged seriously on their right. Christian Democratic parties that have clung to their principled ideas have seen their supporters die off, drift away, or be won over by more attractive rivals and single-issue parties. Those who have maintained their substantial followings, the Austrian, the German, and the Luxembourgian parties, for example, are no longer as openly or pointedly Christian Democratic. They have moved further to the right on economic issues and are more beholden to global markets and to both local and international financial institutions. The Chilean PDC, which is the party with which I began and whose trajectory I have followed closely for more than 35 years, presents somewhat of a mixed profile. It seems it remains committed, at least to this point, to the center-left coalition of which it's been a part since 1990, and yet it has been unwilling to distance itself to any significant degree from that coalition's neoliberal policies. I'm going to stop. I hope in the discussion period to entertain questions and to join in conversation about the fate or the viability of a Christian Democratic Party anywhere in the world in our times, given the degree of secularization and given the aversion to thinking in terms of grand ideas and complex ideological schemes. We seem to have tired or to have retreated from such enterprises as hopelessly beyond our reach, as hopelessly destined to fail. And we seem now to be settled or resigned more than ever to politics as a question of incremental advantage and momentary improvement if possible, but no more grand scale ventures. They raise hopes falsely and they invariably disappoint. And I want to know what the fate of a party boasting of its commitment to such ideals, to such timeless principles, and to such an appropriate way of organizing and ordering one's life. I wonder where their place is in the political arena. Thank you for your patience.
The decline of the Christian Democratic Party gives way to these other little parties that spring up. And that's to say that it's not the case that other mainstream parties, say Social Democrats, hold their own or do better or do better at some of the things that the Christian Democrats, they all go down, all of these parties, and these new little parties just pop up.
That's a great question. Why don't I just
How are the others immune to a fate which I'm condemning the Christian Democrats? I guess for the simple reason that they're not any more willing than the Christian Democrats to distance themselves from the policies that have hurt the Christian Democrats. But I think they're also hurting the Social Democrats and hurting the liberal and the conservative parties that have come to the middle. It seems to me it's much more difficult these days to differentiate among parties in terms of economic policy. And those outlying parties that are willing to do that have no chance of getting into power, much less implementing a program against the resistance of large banks and people whose support and whose cooperation are necessary if any program of any sort is to succeed. I think this is a period in which the lack of trust in political parties generally extends widely and prevents any one of them from escaping. The French election, for example, is a good case in point. And there's not a Christian Democrat in the running.
But Le Pen is not outside the liberal democratic movement.
I'm sorry?
Marine Le Pen is not outside the rejection of
Sure,
the...
she is. She's not yet elected. And even if elected, and we actually have closer to home, of course, an example of someone outside the mix who has been elected. But even if elected, and I don't think Marine Le Pen will be elected, but I certainly could be wrong. Even if elected, I'm not sure that they're going to govern effectively. It's very, very hard in the modern world to govern with powerful institutions and substantial portions of the electorate against what you're trying to do, for good or bad reason.
One thing that was unclear to me in your last remarks, is you were giving the structural reasons, and it seemed to be applicable to all political parties, but it was unclear to me if there were which of those factors impacted the Christian Democrats more than the others, or which would of those the Cold War, the neoliberalism, all of the ones you outlined. Was there one area where they got hurt much more than the general political parties got hurt?
You know, I think it has been chronologically. The bigger part of their decline came between 1997 and 2009, and those are times in which, after a really magnificent beginning, 1990 to 1997, in terms of the performance of the Chilean economy, it fell off badly. They were not rewarded for the good performance. They were punished for the lackluster performance between 1997 and 2004. Although they left power, the coalition didn't, but they lost control of the presidency. It was assumed the presidency of the country on behalf of the coalition was assumed by first a social democrat and a socialist. the Christian Democratic Party receded to the secondary level of coalition. Those were the years of struggle economically, and the coalition was punished with that. Not rewarded for its good performance, but punished for its, and electors will do that to their governments. But I think it was, of the five, I would say it would be their association with neoliberalism has cost them. But frankly, in both the period between 1990 and 97 and the period between 97 and the present day, more often than not, it's circumstantial reasons. It's individual scandals or a wave, raft of scandal, or some other far less momentous factor that turns the electorate against the party. And I would say that it's always been a combination of structural and circumstantial forces, and more often than not, the circumstantial developments or causes are triggers that exploit the opportunity created by the structural and become very decisive, either in enhancing or in blunting the impact of the structure. Politics is an absurdly practical thing in which people's attention and people's priorities focus on little incidents that have no importance in the larger drift of things, but at a moment prove decisive. I don't know if that's an outlandish thing to say publicly, but it's my impression that little things matter an awful lot in politics. It doesn't mean that they control politics, but it means that in a given opportunity in which there's instability and uncertainty caused by structural effects, they can be determining. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Would that be something that's so inherent in democracies generally?
Would that be true of?
Is that something that would be inherent in the character of democracies generally?
It's
That they're more likely to
more likely to
oppose
happen because there's greater participation, more likely to happen because there's greater participation by people who don't know as much.
So they shouldn't have, the notion is that everybody should have an opinion about everything.
That's a cardinal principle deep to the heart of every American, and he shouldn't have to defend it or explain it logically. That would be, or read anything about it before he expresses it. That would be unfortunately true.
You mentioned a little earlier something that really struck me from the whole talk and the whole set of ideas. Is this really a function of the decline of political parties as such? I mean, if you look across the global spectrum, you see Trump, you see Le Pen, you see Hungary, you see basically structures arising that don't link themselves to the 19th century idea of a political party where you have a convention and you have the cigars and the smoke and the stuff. They really lend themselves to very individual sorts of quirky emails and net Twitters and every other damn thing. And it leads to this sort of populist know-nothing that we see ahead of our government, if you want to call them that.
Yeah, I would say yes to all of that. There's a section of this paper that in which I talk about the role of the media in the decline of political parties.
There aren't even the media anymore. In other words, there's no media as such that we relate to.
Well, there is now a media in the vaguest possible sense of that term. And its role in politics today has been one of scrutiny, in which it has literally destroyed the image that political parties had so carefully crafted for themselves by controlling their appearances, by the way they campaign, by the hidden nature of the deals. Well, there are no deals anymore that are hidden for very long. They're articles of popular consumption a half an hour after they take place, because the media has an invasive capacity for scrutiny and apparently a determination to expose the inside or the senior side of political life.
Whether it's true or not.
Whether it's true or not, and very often isn't, but frankly, it doesn't matter because it's rattled and shaken the image of what parties had been successful in getting people to believe about them. The second thing it does is that it offers an alternative source of political education, of information, true or false information, of social identity, of social relationships, all independent of the party on whom people used to depend on which people used to depend. But they'd have to get out of their house and go to the party headquarters in order to have fun, in order to sign up for a job, or in order to meet other people or learn something they didn't know. Now they stay at home, continue to drink in front of the television in the comfort of their home, and digest new information, half of which is untrue, and new social relationships, all of which are artificial, but so what? So I agree.
Well,
I might not answer this question.
I got a big mouth, I don't know. I was kind of thinking about internet trolls when you're talking about, this new debased form of communication. And that drove me back to, I'm really shifting gears here, but the papal encyclical, which is associated with your talk, which I've never read before. And I was really struck by its aspirational tone. And, I could see a lot, of the passion of the Christian Democratic Party. But what I was really struck by was the conflict there on a really basic question, that is the perfectibility of individuals. Because His Holiness is building up this wave of deep enthusiasm for human possibility in the earlier pages, and reflecting back on Leo and on Pius XI. And it was really an amazing experience to read it for the first time. But then I came to this one passage where he's talking about when the state relaxes its hand, so when the people are removed from the embrace of the state. He uses this image of there are many cockles among the wheat. I don't really know what a cockle is. I don't know how it was translated, but I assume what he's talking about is there are men born bad. Cockles among the wheat. How did they become cockles? It seems like an a priori assessment that the state relaxes its hand and we evolve into a Hobbesian state of nature. And in that Hobbesian state, there are still the good people. Those are the ones that were responsive in the first instance to the word. But then the cockles predominate, of course, because they have no restraint. And I was just wondering, in terms of the foundational principles of Christian Democrats, I mean, those that aren't afraid to say what they mean, where do they stand on the issue of, the basic responsiveness of all human beings to right thinking, to good principle?
I won't be able to answer I won't be able to answer for them, for Christian Democrats. I think I have a better idea of what John 23rd might say if you asked him that question. I'll try to be as brief as I can about that. I think he'd be inclined to say that we're all capable of falling off the wagon. In fact, most of us do it regularly. But that there's some kind of hope in climbing back on together and admitting to one another that we can fall off and being inspired by one another to stay on again for as long as we can. Creating a community of flawed people who discover in their community a strength to persist. I think he would go in that general direction. I'm not sure that most Christian Democrats that I've met, they'd all answered very, very differently. I think some of them would resonate in their own experience with what you've just described, and would probably vent themselves at your expense by cases in point, examples that have been so disappointing and disillusioning. But you know, politicians are strong people, and they're not easily discouraged, and they like politics. They enjoy the activity, and they like earning money for just arguing and socializing with one another, and so they don't give up. What's changed is that they don't look as good as they used to in the eyes of the people, because now the people know much more about them than they should, no doubt. But they know much more about them, and they're not prepared to accept their excuses or their rationales. That's what I would.
Well, I just want to follow up briefly. I mean, you also mentioned, you were casting political contests in terms of winning and losing, and I think the experience now, which makes it impossible to read newspapers or even turn on the television, is that the rhetoric is all, the good and evil. We're the good, of course. And even in an echo chamber like this sort of is, where we all kind of think the same way, maybe, about contemporary political events. I mean, when we look at the folks that seem to be predominant now, that we would call internet trolls, or that are, passing legislation in Kentucky, are we characterizing them as outside the political arena? I mean, they're so far removed that they are as cockles as the we, or did the Pope mean in the encyclical, as you seem to indicate, that, well, we're all flawed human beings, but we're all basically the same, basically educable, basically integrable into one political whole. So again, I'm just posing a Manichaean question as Holiness seemed to be struggling with it in the encyclical, because I certainly don't really know where a Christian Democratic Party would situate, its political enemies. I mean, are they political enemies who can be converted, or are they necessary political enemies because they're necessarily outside the principles of which we deal?
Yeah, I think I can tell you what I think the Christian Democrats should do if he or she wanted to remain faithful to their Christian Democratic principles. I don't think you'd allow yourself to define someone as an enemy. One of their problems, one of their reservations about Marxists who identified enemies and who attacked enemies. Christian Democrats are not supposed to do that. Some of them behave as if they did have enemies, but they're not going to call them enemies in advance. They're not going to prejudge. And they're going to try to overcome differences of opinion or of interest. They're trying to mediate. Christian Democratic tradition, as I think you see you pick up in the papal encyclical, is one of mediation of conflicts of interest that are between worthy people worthy of respect, that sort of thing. It might require a solution less than ideal in my judgment, but one that maintains intact the dignity of the people whose interests are opposed to mine. In other words, I'll settle for less. And it can be disappointing to some of my supporters who wanted more, but I'll settle for less if it enables me to remain in some kind of community, certainly peaceful coexistence, if not more than that, with people who disagree with me, people whose interests they would find in different ways.
Just to kind of follow up on the question that you're raising, a very kind of narrow point. That particular cockle in the weeds, of course, comes from the Gospels. And it seems to me the point there is all this truth and goodness has been sown, but look, there's weeds in there. Some enemy has done this. So the key question, I think, there that relates to this is, should we pull the cockles out? Okay, and our Lord's response to that is no. Let them grow together. I take that to mean that if you set out on the course of identifying these are the good people, these are the evil people, and we've got to exterminate the evil, right? That's when things, I think, go badly. And it seems to me that your accompanying piece, The Strange Case of Guilt, had that really embedded in it as I was reading through that, the notion of victimization, right? That is, if someone is doing something that is not perfectly equitable in terms of your immediate look at it, then they're right. We have to go back and blame somebody. That is, we've got to be a victim to make ourselves feel good. We've got to show that there's all these other things that are unjust about us, and that we're not going to let those evil people, right, have their way. And I just a comment on that.
Anyone else? Just ask for the mic.
I'm just wondering if democracy is, I don't need that. Democracy is kind of messy and usually kind of inefficient. And I was just wondering if you think that parties in general that we're going to maybe evolve beyond parties in a way like the new generations getting their information all from the internet, for better or for worse, and that maybe parties aren't necessary, but maybe they are. That's what I'm wondering about.
Yeah, I'm wondering about that too, and I have no read on that I can come to. I think remains to be seen. Parties can work if the people that make up parties work. Parties aren't a cost-free solution. If you want your party to work, you got to join your party, and you got to go to your party's meetings, and you got to struggle within the party in order for the party to be accountable to you, and in order for the party to do something it should do, rather than something that's paid to do by a lobbyist or by a strategy advisor who wants it to win the next election. Most people, I'm afraid, love the idea of democracy, but not the practice of democracy, and they don't want to pay the price of, and the idea of being able to do it at home, in front of the computer or the television is very attractive. You get to have it both ways.
That's right. What's the future of monarchy?
Here's John. Robert. I'm not a monarchist, but I'm a fan of G.K. Chesterton, and he has an essay on why the monarchy is a more reliable form of government than any other. He's not that, what Churchill who said that democracy was not the best, but it was better than anything else that had been tried. But Chesterton did not have in mind the qualities of most monarchs. In fact, he regarded their lack of quality as an advantage, because it would be less likely that they would be tempted into ambitious projects of the sort that, in Chesterton's view, screw up everything. The real danger for him was the policy wonk, who thought he knew what the country needed, and he was determined to give it to them whether they wanted it or not.
There's talk of Sean Connery becoming the next king of Scotland.
So a question here in terms of, you mentioned, I can talk to you, right?
I think I'll turn this on. I don't know how to turn it on.
So you mentioned the middle class being more entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
I believe in air quotes it would be.
Yeah, did you resonate with
Yeah,
that?
I was like, oh, entrepreneurial. So and you mentioned kind of factions, and so I'm kind of tying the two together with the new generation being, the middle class being entrepreneurial in the sense of more about me, like how can I benefit, how can I receive more money, and not caring so much about the social implications for certain actions, right? If you kind of play that out to being smaller factions, almost giving power in like a demagogue-like sense of like, this guy represents my factional beliefs, I want jobs. I don't care how I get jobs, I just want jobs. And they're not looking at the big picture. If you don't have the cohesive factional ability to pass like legislation in the structural form that happens, how do you see this playing out?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a question to be kept in mind as we observe this new administration, Mr. Trump's. We're going to learn a lot about how easy or not so easy it is to translate a vision of the economy into productive and equitable new forms or ways of doing things. As to whether the move towards less skeptical, more comfortable relationship with entrepreneurial activity, I think it very much depends on what kind of enterprise you run. I don't think that private equity investors is a very Christian way to earn a living or share its benefits, it seems to me. But being the president of a company that employs people and interacts with his or her employees on a regular basis and gives them a reasonable share in the product that they're producing together, one that's a proportion to their contribution, I'm all in favor of that, and I think Catholic social teaching would bless that. The problem is that you don't always get that, because the laws of the marketplace are pretty harsh, and if people do certain things, they think, well, gee, I'm not going to be able to keep my investors happy, because they want a bottom line that's a little more succulent or juicy then I give them, if I had my druthers, I'd like to have employee profit sharing and other such things. But they would cut into the people who, the return on the investment of people who are financing my operation. And that's the reality. None of our existing entrepreneurs are owners of their own company. They're managers of a company financed by faceless outside investors. And those guys don't want to hear or read a social encyclical. They want return on their investment. That's the business that they're in. I think, frankly, the reorganization and restructuring of financial institutions is probably way more important than anything else. It seems to me that the crisis that we ran into in 2008 was exactly that of a sector of the economy run amok. And if you don't regulate it, it'll do exactly what it did then, and will do again.
Yeah, just following on that, I mean, looking at Christian Democratic parties now, in their, is there any one of them that has an articulated principle that challenges the notion that the economy should be run to maximize shareholder value? Is there any one of them that has come out?
I would not be able to answer that question unless about a year and a half ago, the same question occurred to me, and I went to the website of the Christian Democratic Union, Christian Social Union, and I read their statement of principle. And yes, on paper, they say, no way. But Angela Merkel's policies since 1996, since whenever it was that she replaced Schrader, had been austerity and export promotion and minimal amounts of budgetary resources to address the growing problems of poverty and inequality in Germany, of all places. The model economy, the one that I used to teach and preach to my students about as a model way for running an economy in a complex world order.
And the corporations have been realizing significant profits for the shareholders.
They have been. They have been.
And the CEOs are getting, 19 million a year, well, nobody else does.
You mean the German corporations? Yeah. I think, I can't speak for individual corporations. I know that the banks have had a lot of trouble. Deutsche Bank in particular, and they've been among the worst offenders of in this area of money and financial projects. But I can't say, I lost the thought. I can't say anything about the corporations. I can say that the German government the German economy has done pretty well in not only minimizing the damage to its own economy as a result of but sharing the burden of that downturn among the population generally. It's just that they're stuck, committed to neoliberalism, and they're compensating for it with resources that they have in abundance and that some countries and governments don't have access to, with which to. Those questions I raised at the beginning, I think are really important. How do you mitigate the downside of neoliberal economics? And unfortunately, you need to have great resources at your disposal in order to do that.
Question over there. He was first.
I'll let you guys decide that.
Go ahead.
Okay. How about the German case varies from state to state? To the extent that Germany is still federal.
Yeah.
Depends on where you are. If you're in Bavaria, you're in one situation.
That's a very interesting question. I can't answer because I don't know.
So I'm not going to ask that question. But in your view, how much of the German problem emanates from Brussels? From monetary policy, which is
I
EU policy,
believe, and I could be reading the wrong people, but I believe that the German banks and the German leadership inform the Brussels presidency or commission.
They do to some, it's a negotiation, eh?
And within Germany, it's what's his name, Schnabel,
Yes.
in Bavaria, who drives German thinking on these questions. But I can't answer that question either. That's what I read.
Yeah.
And to bring it up to today or tomorrow, when's the runoff in France?
Sunday.
It is.
We'll know at 2
To bring it up to date, what are the dynamics between the French and the German economies and government? And could and will France, will the French-German collaboration survive the leaving, the Brexit, and the difficulties that the Union is facing? Those are all very serious questions.
In some of your remarks, it seemed like about parties and general sort of decline in the effectiveness of parties and exposure of their sort of image-making functionality, I guess, and that leading to sort of problems in democracy. It seemed like this is a story about the failure of a sort of mediating institution within democracy to mediate between people who don't have much time to spend on politics and learn about things and so on, and the decisions, and so it's sort of a representational mediating institution problem and failure. So is there any correlation in the fate of Christian democratic parties and the state of Christian civic institutions generally? Is that something that you see in the comparative politics side of your study here?
One of the political or electoral problems that Christian democratic parties are having is they no longer feed off of the Catholic social organizations as they once did in their beginnings. They literally co-opted an entire generation of apostolic Catholic organizations. Those have, I suppose, with secularization, those have themselves gone into decline, and I think the ballast that they provided to parties and to the society as a whole, has been lost. And I'm not sure how. I mean, those organizations, think about it, they grew up in the 30s in the interwar period when conditions were terrible, and where community associations were an obvious resource and possible solution to. Solidarity among people was apparent. The need for it was apparent to everyone. That's no longer the case.
those of us in this country who have enough, and many people in other countries who don't have enough, don't realize it either, that solidarity still is necessary. They think they can live within their own, a world of their own making and selection, and they don't need one another as badly as I would argue that they really do. Just sounding boards, we need one another, and as sources of criticism, as opportunities for joy and happiness of a real sort, not a virtual sort. None of that is as easily accessible as it is under difficult circumstances. Chile's a perfect example of that. Life in Chile under the dictatorship was horrible, and yet it was a period of solidarity, unbelievable solidarity among victims. That uplifted everybody. But success, be careful of it, because the ease of life, the solution of problems relieves us all of a certain need for one another.
I have a question, something I don't know anything about, so maybe you can help me. Has any of the Christian Democratic parties ever tried to take advantage of the environmental movement in terms of any kind of philosophical link to that in the Christian framework? Has it ever been talked about?
It is talked about, it's mentioned in the German Declaration of Principles, which are very careful in absorbing and reproducing the instructions, and the exhortations of papal documents. And church documents on the environment have been very good in the last 30 years, I would say. This Pope is marvelous in that regard, in his awareness and in his capacity to articulate and promote respect for the environment. There's a whole theology of the environment.
But the Green parties have never linked up with the Christian Democrats, have they? Or there's never been a talk of any kind of coalition in European Green movements?
I think more enlightened Christian Democrats might be very interested in that. I think lots of environmentalists are secular and suspicious of Christian Democrats.
Right. But yet, their opponent is so stupid that why don't they?
Neoliberalism is going to bring some people together that might not have
Might not otherwise.
Going to get 30s again. We got the 30s are upon us. We may see it or we may not see it, but I think
we may not see it.
We may not see it.
Speak for yourself.
That was pretty good. Yeah.
Move over on this ice floe. I want room for mine.
Yeah.
No movement by Christian Democrat, Social Democratic parties to kind of build their own pools of capital to loan to companies that would treat their workers better. I mean, at one time in Sweden, the labor unions were going to loan money to corporations. Maybe there's not enough money.
I've lived in Chile for a number of years, and off and on, and it's a country whose politics and whose Christian Democrats I know pretty well. And I would say the answer there is not that there are not wealthy Christian Democrats, but there's not enough money to do that. That's a task for a Christian Democratic Party with very close ties to a foundation like the Adenauer Foundation or. It is possible. I have an extremely promising idea of financial independence and the freedom of maneuver and of initiative that offers you.
It could also put pressure on liberal banks.
Yeah, it could.
In terms of people's commitment towards, social structures, and there's, I mean, I think we can all agree there's been a redistribution of power within corporations and the public entities around. As the balance continues to shift, which it will, with certain events going into place, where do you think a person's obligation will end up falling? Say they're, you know, a democratic Christian, and they want to maintain a, you know, outward look to, you know, benefit social things. However, the methods or the structure that we used to be able to plug into to support those endeavors, you know, crumble and fall away. How do you think people will start to pivot and adjust to try and create those? Because you're losing, you know, your political power, your social movement, elements within there. There's now restructuring of economic resources that have allowed you to do so. So what do you think is going to be the outcome? I mean, there's going to be an outlet. The question is, what do you think it will take be the form of?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because frankly, we all need institutions. None of us can do much on our own. We have to create institutions. We can't plug into just any institution because some of them are going to block, consciously or unconsciously, they're going to block our path, our achievement. Can we establish our own and financial finance them? I guess I find government institutions and financial institutions dangerous places, whose thinking and whose agenda are very difficult to change. I think they are what they are, and I think I would be in favor of getting independent philanthropical support for autonomous nonprofit institutions. I would also, partly in honor of one of my daughters who worked for years with microfinance, I would encourage for-profit institutions of a moderate or of an appropriate sort, so they can generate their own resources and they don't have to depend on philanthropic donors, but are self-sufficient in an effective and in an adequate way. Small scale, necessarily. I think one of the things I have the greatest amount of hope in is in the potential for the development of creative, artistic and entertainment companies that make lots of money, but that are run by people whose desire is not to make lots of money, but to use that as a vehicle for reaching people with ideas and with messages of one sort or another. Too many of those companies are funded by private equity investors who don't care one whit about the goal of the company. They want to use the company. I'm hopeful that in your generation are lots of creative thinkers and artists who succeed in the marketplace and who can use their success in the marketplace for their own companies, a Christian or principled agenda, and above all to educate, because frankly, conventional educational institutions aren't doing what they should be doing either. And we find new ways to educate people politically and morally.
Going off that point, highlighting the fact that there are flaws, potential flaws, existing flaws in both corporate individuals and governments as a whole. I mean, could we say that the democratic Christian movement failed because it led itself to methods that are not necessarily Christian, nor necessarily successful?
Yeah.
Namely, the socialist principles, which I would say are to a large extent necessarily not Christian because it removes the possibility of charity for the individual. And two, democracy, which mob rule is not justification of anything in and of itself.
Yeah, I wouldn't call that a democracy, but you're right. We're our own worst enemy. We fail to live up to the principles that we commit ourselves to all too often. We're responsible for the for the loss of credibility and respectability in those, in the public generally. Because we haven't been as principled or as, but I guess I would still fall back on the idea that you can try again and you can persist, even though you yourself don't always succeed, even though your enterprise doesn't. There's nothing worse than giving up.
And my intention is to say that we ought to give up merely the method itself of the state coercion through to mandate, the economic equality, if you will.
Yeah. Again, I guess I would say, let's not generalize about state actions. It seems to me that a state whose political institutions adjudicate and regulate activity that has adverse effects on the interests of some and beneficial effects on the interests of others is not imposing those decisions. It's not forcing people to act well or be good. It's making inevitable choices among options that have different consequences or implications for different sectors of the community. That's precisely why states are necessary, because it's so difficult to do that. And because anyone who has the power to do that ought to be accountable to someone else for the way in which they exercise that power. But I don't think you can say that any time a law is passed or a law is enforced that somebody's rights have been savaged or disregarded. It seems to me that we lose as citizens as often as we win, because our interests, as we understand them, are not always those that prevail. But the very most and least we can hope for is to be treated as human beings, and to be protected in terms of the enjoyment of our rights, if not in the secure advancement of our interests. We ought to be able to say what we need to say in defense of our interests, but we have no right to demand that our interests be those that prevail in any kind of conflict of interest. It's the process that's more important than the outcome. That's a principle of liberal political thought, that it matters much more how freely you do things than what is actually done. Because no solution that is imposed, however just it might be in someone's mind, is a just solution if it's done at the expense of the people involved. So I'm saying I agree with you, but I don't share your view that, I agree with you in terms of the inviolable rights of the individual, but I think we would define them differently from the tone of your question.
I agree with that.
Isn't the purpose of regulation often for a common good? I mean, and then go back to the question we had in the seminar, that relation between the individual and the common good. And, it seems to me, if we're social beings, that a common good often has to prevail.
Locke put it.
Not like Robespierre, but.
Locke put it better than anybody. In order for someone to be free, you have to restrict the liberty of someone else.
I mean, what's
That's
a
a
regulatory
limitation of the
establishment?
human condition. We can't all be free in the same way. Some of us, to protect or preserve the freedom of those, some of us must pay the price, if not of our freedom, of our will to have what we would have, our desire to have more.
That's a huge difference than what you just said is that draws a distinction between freedom and preferences. And so some would say that not being able to do whatever you want is a hindrance on freedom.
always. And we thank our speakers.